I grew up in a place older than life itself, and something from those ancient hills decided I belonged to it. The hollows of southern Appalachia and western North Carolina, about half an hour outside Asheville, were the only world I knew. Those mountains are among the oldest geological formations on the planet. Some of the rock beneath your feet dates back over 1 billion years, meaning the ground you're standing on existed before any creature ever crawled across it. When something has been rooted in the earth that long, it accumulates things. Energies, presences, some you can explain, most you cannot. Take the Brown Mountain Lights, for instance. I've watched them from Wiseman's View more times than I can count, and never once did they make me feel anything close to fear. They simply exist, hovering, pulsing, indifferent to whoever watches them. On the gentler side, there's an old abandoned church up near my parents' property line where, if you step inside, you're hit with a warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. It's the kind of feeling you get on the first perfect day of spring. The sun on your skin, the world briefly in balance. But this story isn't about something gentle. This is about the thing that chose me. About 10 years ago, I was attending evening classes at the community college, automotive mechanics. I'd finished my part-time job, head to class around 2 in the afternoon, and wouldn't get home until roughly 10:30 at night, depending on how the highway traffic cooperated. Every night I drove the same stretch of road in my old 1973 Dodge W200 pickup. Some evenings, when the monotony got to me, I'd hop off I-40 and wind through the back roads just to break the routine. But not this night. It was a Thursday. No class the next day. I had plans to wake up before dawn, hike deep into the forest, and watch the sunrise crack open over the ridgeline. So I stayed on I-40, eager to get home, get to sleep, get into the woods early. The moment I pulled off at my exit, the world changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle, the kind of shift you feel in your chest before your brain catches up. The darkness seemed to thicken as though the night itself had drawn closer. Through my rolled-down windows, the symphony of insects and tree frogs that normally filled the mountain air had gone completely mute. I'd never experienced anxiety before that moment. Not real anxiety, the kind that grips your ribs and squeezes. But something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, and I couldn't have told you what it was if my life depended on it. I rolled past the truck stop at the bottom of the exit, a 24-hour place, always blazing with fluorescent light and diesel fumes. It was pitch black, every light extinguished. I chalked it up to a power outage and kept driving, but the unease didn't leave. If anything, it tightened. I shifted gently through the gears, instinctively trying to keep the old truck quiet, though I couldn't have told you why. I leaned forward over the steering wheel and looked up through the windshield at the sky. On any normal night back home, you could see the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of crushed glass. That night, the stars were almost entirely absent. No clouds, no overcast haze, just absence, like something had drawn a curtain across the sky. I rounded a sharp, left-hand curve and straightened into a brief stretch before the next bend. There was a barn along this road, ancient, sagging, its wood gray and split with age. I always looked at it when I passed, wondering how many generations of people had lived and died while it slowly returned to the earth. For just a moment, my eyes drifted toward it. That's when the dog appeared. It materialized out of the darkness no more than 10 feet ahead of my bumper, massive, gaunt, wrong in ways I couldn't immediately process. Old Betsy was a reliable truck, but she never stopped quickly. I stomped the brake. A fence post I'd left in the truck bed, launched forward, cracked against the cab, and slid back. The tires screamed across the asphalt. My first coherent thought, once the truck shuddered to a halt, was, "Oh God, I just killed someone's dog." Where I'm from, that's not a small thing. Depending on whose dog it is, that conversation can go sideways fast. I sat there for a moment, the acrid bite of burnt rubber filling the cab. And then another smell crept in beneath it. The unmistakable stench of decomposing flesh. It's a smell that tattoos itself onto your memory the first time you encounter it. I dismissed it. Roadkill. Had to be. I pressed the clutch, shifted into reverse, and glanced into my rearview mirror. The dog was standing up. Not standing the way a dog stands. Standing the way a person stands. Upright on 2 legs. And it was enormous. My truck's hood sat a solid 5 feet off the ground, and when this thing had been on all fours, its shoulder had been level with the hood. Now, on 2 legs, it towered well past 10 feet. The reverse lights cast everything in a bloodless white glow, and in that glow I saw it clearly. It was not a dog. It was not a man. It occupied some hideous space between the two, and at the same time, it was something entirely its own, something that had no business existing in any category the natural world had ever produced. The skin hung off its frame like wet fabric, draped over scaffolding. The body beneath was emaciated, skeletal, starved-looking, every joint and vertebrae pressing outward against that loose gray hide. Patches of matted fur clung to its legs in clumps, tangled with mud and filth, as though the creature had been crawling through the earth itself. One arm, the right, hung noticeably longer than the left, and both dangled far lower than they should have on any proportioned body, the knuckles nearly grazing its knees. Then it turned its head. It looked directly into my mirror, not toward the truck, not in my general direction. Into the mirror, at me, as if it understood exactly where my eyes were. The face was almost human, almost. The basic architecture was there, a forehead, cheekbones, a jaw, but the edges of its features refused to hold still. They rippled and shifted like watching cell division under a microscope. The boundaries of its face were in constant, subtle motion, as though the thing hadn't fully decided what it wanted to look like. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow sockets, not closed, not scarred over, just empty, black, void. The nose was flat and crushed inward like a bulldog's, barely a stub of cartilage mashed against the skull. And the teeth, God, the teeth. They were unmistakably carnivorous, long, sharp, built for tearing, but they weren't arranged the way teeth should be. They jutted from the gums at wrong angles, overlapping, crowding against one another, some seeming to grow outward from places. Teeth had no right to be. They didn't sit in the mouth so much as they overflowed from it, as though the jaw was too small to contain them and they were forcing their way free. It stared at me through that mirror. Through my eyes. Through whatever was behind my eyes. 5 seconds. Maybe less. It felt like drowning. Then a porch light snapped on at the house beside the road. The creature's head whipped toward the light with an almost mechanical speed, and then it was gone, tearing into the tree line on its hind legs, moving with a fluid, horrifying stride that no bipedal creature should possess. I slammed the truck into first gear, dumped the clutch, and left rubber on the road all the way through second. I don't remember shifting into third. I don't remember most of the drive home. I remember arriving. Both my parents were asleep. I went downstairs to my basement bedroom and loaded every weapon I owned, locked every door, checked every window. The house was unnervingly silent. My parents' dogs, animals that would normally erupt into a frenzy at the sound of a raccoon 50 yards away, were utterly still, not sleeping, just the old post and beam house, which normally groaned and settled throughout the night with a familiar creak of old timber, made no sound at all, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Around 3 a.m. Exhaustion finally began to pull me under. I told myself I'd still go hiking in the morning. I told myself none of it had been real. I started to lower my head to the pillow. And then the smell returned, faint at first. A whisper of rot carried on still air. But it grew. Steadily, relentlessly, it intensified until the entire basement was saturated with the reek of something long dead and badly wrong. My father's home office occupies part of the basement. 2 large glass doors face the backyard, which opens directly onto the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, 500,000 acres of unbroken wilderness. I climbed out of bed, picked up my short-barreled tactical 12 gauge, and moved into the basement living room. The mounted flashlight on the shotgun was my only source of illumination. I kept my hand cupped over the lens, letting only the faintest sliver of light escape between my fingers. I didn't want whatever was out there to know where I was. Not yet. I turned right out of the living room into my father's office, stepped to the glass doors, slowly lifted my hand from the light and let the beam cut into the darkness. At the edge of the woods, perhaps 40 yards from the house, it stood, motionless. Those empty sockets stared directly into the beam of light. It did not flinch. It did not blink. It had nothing to blink with. It simply stood there, facing me, as though it had been waiting. I killed the light, sprinted to the living room, hit the switch for the exterior floodlights. The yard erupted in white halogen brightness, and in that instant I saw that the creature was no longer at the tree line. It was standing in the middle of the yard, halfway between the forest and the house, still motionless. It had covered 30 yards in the 2 seconds it had taken me to reach the light switch, and it hadn't made a single sound. I didn't think. I threw the back door open and fired. Every shell, as fast as I could rack the slide. The muzzle flash strobed the yard in violent bursts of orange. At least 2 rounds must have connected because the thing released a sound, a shriek that I will carry to my grave. It was the scream of a woman being murdered, raw and shrill and impossibly loud, but underneath it was something deeper, something that vibrated in the bones rather than the ears. It wheeled and crashed into the forest, branches snapping, undergrowth shredding in its wake. The dogs upstairs exploded into howling. My parents came thundering down, wanting to know what in God's name I was doing. I told them a bear had gotten into the garbage and I'd fired some rounds to scare it off. They didn't believe me, but I knew they wouldn't have believed the truth either. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. I didn't close my eyes until Sunday, and even then, sleep came only in brief, shallow intervals filled with formless dread. Years passed. I buried the memory as deep as I could. I didn't speak of it. I didn't let myself think about it, and slowly, mercifully, it faded into something I could almost convince myself had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and darkness and an overactive imagination. Then I met my wife Clara about 6 years later. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of a hollow, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the same road from my parents' place. Up on the hillside behind the property, there's a set of old kennels her brother once used for his hunting dogs. They hadn't housed dogs in years, but the chain link runs and concrete pads were still intact, useful for quarantining an animal when the need arose. Clara's Great Pyrenees, a 150-pound guardian dog named Boone, had tangled with a raccoon and won decisively, but his rabies vaccination had lapsed. Regulations required a quarantine period. Boone didn't seem to mind the solitude. He was a calm, contemplative dog, content to sit in the kennel and watch the tree line with the quiet authority of his breed. The night we went to bring him home was his last night of quarantine. We'd spent the day in a neighboring town watching a movie, and by the time we parked at our mother's and started up the trail to the kennels, full dark had settled over the hollow. We used our phone flashlights to navigate the path. Boone was waiting patiently, tail swaying in slow, measured sweeps when he saw us. We clipped his leash and started back. We were maybe halfway down the trail when the feeling hit me. It was identical. The same nameless wrongness, the same tightening in the chest, the same primal certainty that something was watching from the darkness. I said nothing. I didn't want to frighten Clara. Then the smell rolled in. She caught it before I could react. Lord have mercy, what did you eat? She laughed, waving her hand in front of her nose. You reek. I tried to laugh. It came out hollow and unconvincing. Her smile faded immediately. She'd grown up in these mountains too. Hunting, tracking, reading the woods the way other people read books. She knew what it meant when something felt off in the forest. She didn't need me to spell it out. Tell me later, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. We picked up the pace. The lights of the house became visible through the trees below us, and for a brief moment, I thought we'd make it without incident. Then the barking started behind us. It came from the direction of the kennel, deep, booming barks that sounded exactly like Boone, a flawless reproduction. Except Boone was right beside us, hackles raised, his leash taut in my hand. The only sound coming from him was a low, continuous growl, a rumble so deep I could feel it vibrating through the leather lead. I'd had guardian dogs my entire life. I'd never heard one make a sound quite like that. It was the noise an animal makes when it recognizes something as a fundamental threat to its existence. The barking from the darkness didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. I grabbed Boone's collar and hauled him toward the house. Dragging 150 pounds of enraged livestock guardian dog downhill through the dark while your wife runs beside you is not something I'd recommend. I'm 6 feet tall and 240 pounds, and it was everything I had to keep him moving in the right direction. He wanted to turn and fight. Every instinct in his breeding was screaming at him to face whatever was coming down that trail behind us. The barking pursued us. It closed the distance with sickening speed, growing louder and more distorted until it seemed to originate from inside my own skull, not behind me, but around me, as if the sound had detached from any physical source and become something else entirely. Claire's mother heard the chaos and hit the exterior floods. Light poured across the yard and up the hillside. As we crashed through the fence gate, I spun around just in time to see something at the far reach of the light, a shape, tall and wrong, skidding to an abrupt halt. For one frozen heartbeat it stood there. Then it reversed direction and ripped back into the blackness with a speed that made my stomach turn. Clara grabbed my arm. Her face was white. "You want to tell me what the hell that was?" "Yeah," I said. "Let's go inside." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to recognition to something I can only describe as grim understanding. Clara's family came from a long line of granny women, Appalachian folk healers, root workers, the kind of people who occupied the gray space between herbalism and something older and less exquisite. She didn't dismiss what I told her. She didn't try to rationalize it. Her older sister, Nadine, came over the following morning carrying a bundle of dried herbs and speaking words I didn't fully understand. She moved through the property with quiet efficiency, burning and chanting at thresholds and corners and the four cardinal edges of the land. I suggested we go up to the kennels as well. When we reached them, the sight stopped all three of us. The kennels were destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The chain-link fencing had been ripped from its steel posts like tissue paper and lay in twisted heaps across the hillside. The heavy wooden doghouses were splintered into kindling, and the concrete pad, 4 inches of reinforced concrete, was cracked clean through, split by a force I couldn't begin to calculate. The entire area was drenched in the smell. That smell, the one that had followed me for a decade. Nadine didn't react. She walked through the wreckage as calmly as if she were strolling through a garden, performing her blessings, burning her bundles, murmuring her protections. When we returned to the house, she turned to us with an intensity I'd never seen from her before. "Do not go into the woods after dark," she said. "Not either of you. Not until this thing moves on." She didn't say if it moves on. Clara eventually enlisted in the military and received orders to a base in Delaware. For someone who'd spent his entire life surrounded by ancient mountains and endless wilderness, the mid-Atlantic flatlands felt like being exiled to another planet. We landed first in a city of 50,000 people, which was its own particular kind of misery. But before long, we found a house in a quiet community further south. A modest place at the end of a dead-end road, bordered on one side by a small, unremarkable patch of woods. We were both relieved to be out of the city, but Delaware felt empty in a way that went beyond the absence of mountains. The woods there had no presence, no energy. In Appalachia, the forest is alive, not just biologically, but in some deeper, more fundamental way. The ground hums. The air holds memory. Delaware's woods were just trees, soil, silence. The land felt inert, as though nothing of consequence had ever happened there, and nothing ever would. I took comfort in that emptiness. If there was nothing living in these woods, nothing in the deeper sense, then perhaps there was nothing dead in them either. I hadn't thought about the creature in a long time. I started going outside after dark again, playing with the dogs in the yard, building fires, relaxing into the kind of rural peace I'd been missing. Last night, I went out after sunset to throw the ball for the dogs. The air was cool and still. I built a fire in the pit, poured myself a generous measure of old-fashioned Appalachian mountain cough syrup from a mason jar, and sat watching the flames work through the wood. As the fire burned low, my American bulldog, a stocky, fearless, 110-pound wrecking ball named Hank, suddenly bolted toward the woods. He does this sometimes. He's an adventurer, an escape artist, the kind of dog who treats a property line as a suggestion. My reflexes kicked in before my brain did. I sprinted after him across the yard, tackled him in the grass, and hauled him up across my shoulders in a fireman's carry, and that's when I heard him bark. Except the bark wasn't coming from him. Hank's mouth was closed. The only sound leaving his body was a growl, deep, guttural, continuous. A sound I had never heard him produce in the 4 years I'd owned him. It was the sound of a dog who understood on some cellular level that he was in the presence of something that should not exist. The barking was coming from the woods, and it sounded exactly like him. I ran. Hank on my shoulders, his growl vibrating against the back of my neck, the stench of putrefaction rolling across the yard in waves. The other 2 dogs were already at the back door, scratching and whining, desperate to get inside. I threw the door open, dumped all 3 dogs in, slammed it shut, turned the deadbolt, and went straight for the gun safe. How? That was the only thought in my head as I chambered around with shaking hands. How is it here? We're 650 miles from those mountains. We're in a different state, different land, different woods. I hid the floodlights on the back of the house. The yard lit up in cold white light. At the far edge of illumination, where the mowed grass meets the first row of scrubby trees, several bushes and saplings were still thrashing violently, swaying and snapping as though something enormous had just torn through them at full speed. Then they went still. The dogs didn't stop barking until dawn. They threw themselves at the windows. They howled in registers I didn't know they could reach. I sat in the hallway with my back against the wall and a loaded shotgun across my knees and watched the doors. I didn't sleep. I don't think I will for a while. For a long time, I believed this thing was tied to a place, to those ancient haunted mountains, to the billion-year-old bones of the earth that birthed it. I thought if I left, it would stay. I thought distance was enough. I was wrong. It isn't following a location, it's following me. And last night, as I sat in the dark listening to my dogs lose their minds and smelling that familiar rot seep under the door, I realized something else. Something that hasn't let go of me since. Every time I've encountered it, it's been closer than the time before. Every time, it takes a little longer to leave. And last night, when I turned on those floodlights and saw those bushes shaking, they weren't shaking at the edge of the woods. They were shaking at the edge of the porch.